So, Peter, you've just written about the new Taiwanese president, and I have to ask, does Lai Ching-te have one of the toughest jobs in politics? Many Australians might not often think of Taiwan or who leads the country, but the particular challenges that he faces seem particularly difficult.
Well, he does face all the typical problems that a national leader has at the moment. Cost of living is a problem in Taiwan. Inflation's been a problem. Housing costs, people have the same grizzles. But many fewer countries have a large, looming, autocratic state, 180 kilometres from the border, for years threatening to invade you, take control of you, and the threats only step up. There are other countries that do have a neighbour like that, just about any country that borders Russia, especially its western borders. Poland, any of the Baltic states. Finland has a very long border with Russia. Sweden, they're all anxious, very anxious about Russia's intentions, which is why Sweden and Finland have just joined NATO, of course. But they have a treaty. They are all members of NATO, a collective defence alliance which includes all of Western Europe, but also the US and Canada. Whereas Taiwan has a very ambiguous situation where the US supplies it with arms and gives it some rhetorical love, but doesn't recognise it diplomatically, has no formal relationship with it, and has maintained a position of so-called strategic ambiguity. In other words, not clarifying whether it would or would not help in the event of a war. Although Joe Biden has messed with the script a bit and 4 times now said that the US would definitively just said, yes, we would defend Taiwan if they were invaded. Still, it's a dodgy, difficult position to be in. And most countries, only about a dozen countries on the planet recognise Taiwan diplomatically. It's constantly fighting to keep access to things like the World Health Organization, any international agreement or protocol, because the Chinese mainland's always trying to chase them out of it. It's a tenuous and marginal position to occupy. So he may well, Lai may well have one of the, and perhaps the most difficult job in the world.
And would it be fair to say that he faces an even trickier time as Taiwanese president now with current conditions with China and other global factors than his predecessor did? And if so, why?
Because each year grows closer to what many think is the inevitable Beijing attempt by the mainland Chinese Communist Party to seize, invade, or otherwise blockade or dominate Taiwan. Many people have put timelines on it, estimated it, guesstimated it. 2025, one top US general said he expected it to happen. That's next year. 2027, said another. Others, sinologists, have said 2035. So whatever year you pick, whatever speculation you want to listen to, those years are coming closer by the day. So yes, the job gets harder.
And can you tell me a bit more about Lai? Because I thought it was very interesting. You pointed out in your piece, he's the son of a coal miner, and he could be the person to lead Taiwan into war should this happen with China. And Chinese President Xi Jinping is quite open about his dislike of Lai, to say the very least. So tell me a bit about what's going on there.
Yeah. Well, he is the son of a coal miner, although he ended up doing some time at Harvard, so he's not completely uneducated. Earlier in his life, he was a very hot-headed, outspoken advocate for formal independence, breaking away formally from China. China has made it very plain that any attempt at a formal declaration of independence would be met with its full military force. So that's dangerous. However, in recent years, and he's been serving as vice president, by the way, to the outgoing President Tsai Ing-wen, and under her, he has moderated his opinion. As vice president, he's been much more orthodox. He's dumped his hot-headed views, and he has said, we don't need to declare independence. And this also was Tsai Ing-wen's position. We don't need to declare formal independence because we have all the benefits of independence de facto. Therefore, we don't need formal. So he's moderated his views. He's become a pretty centrist, sensible politician in the spectrum of Taiwanese politics. However, as you said, that will not redeem him with Xi Jinping, the Chinese dictator, because Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party has a visceral loathing and detestation for the party that William Lai Ching-te, represents. And before him, his predecessor and the woman to whom he was deputy, Tsai Ing-wen, they are from the DPP, Democratic People's Party. They're traditionally the more anti-Beijing, more pro-independence party. So the Chinese Communist Party has a deep inherent hatred and suspicion of the DPP. It favours the other major party, the Kuomintang, which has traditionally dominated politics in China. Interestingly, that's changed because this William Lai Ching-te's term will now be the third. He was just elected. It's the third consecutive term to be served by a DPP leader. So, in other words, the Taiwanese people seem pretty happy to stick with the party that Beijing, that Xi Jinping detests. That tells you something. That's pretty powerful.
But I believe his party struggles a bit, doesn't it? Because it doesn't have a majority, as I understand it. And you wrote in your piece that just last week on Friday, I believe, there was a fight that broke out amongst some of the legislators. So tell me about that.
Taiwan does have a bit of a scrappy history of badly behaved legislators. They call it the legislative yuan meaning round, circle, like the Chinese currency is called the yuan. In Taiwan, they call their parliament the yuan. They break out into fisticuffs every now and then when frustrations boil over, and they did on Friday, which is not a great look when you're about to showcase your democracy with the inauguration of your new president, and then in the parliament they're all hitting each other and grabbing each other. Some bloke grabbed a copy of the bill that they were about to vote on and tried to run away with it. Pretty puerile stuff. The reason they were all fighting was because the opposition party, the Kuomintang, wanted to bring a bill that would impose new levels of scrutiny on the on the government, including criminalising misleading parliament. So if any official were deemed by a parliamentary vote to have misled the parliament, they could go to jail. So there's high stakes, I suppose, and high spirits and high jinks and high energy. So they broke. To stop the fighting, they broke. They resumed again. There's more fighting, punching, pulling, shoving, climbing over desks. Undignified, to say the least. And yes, as you say, the president's party has just lost control. In the election that elected him president, his party, the DPP, lost a majority of the legislature. No other party has a majority either, so they're just going to have to cobble together the numbers as and when they can. But it's going to be a more difficult management task than it was for his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen. She had a majority consistently.
Okay, and you mentioned that Lai has more moderate views than he once did. I know that in 2017, he declared himself to be a, quote, pragmatic worker for Taiwanese independence, which I think is what angers Xi Jinping so much.
Exactly what Xi Jinping loathes.
Exactly. So tell us about what Lai actually said in his inaugural speech on Monday. Did it quell or stoke Beijing's fears?
Well, nothing will ever totally and comprehensively calm or soothe or quell Beijing's fears. As long as it's the DPP, the Democratic People's Party, the Chinese Communist Party will always suspect it, regardless of what it says. But he didn't stoke China's fears either, their fears of a formal breakaway or independence. He was quite firm in saying, I call on China to stop. I call on the Chinese Communist Party to stop the intimidation that's been going on, the military, the relentless sorties, naval and air, that the Chinese mainland has been conducting. I call on Beijing to stop the intimidation, to recognize that we are two equal states. Well, he didn't use the word states, two equals, and that we should live in peace. peace is the only option was one of his quotes. And essentially the status quo is his position, which has been this position for years, but he said it, let's keep things as they are. Of course, Beijing doesn't want to hear that the two, in Lai's view, have equal standing, but he was essentially saying, let's keep things as they are and just stop bullying us. I'm afraid the chances of that are forlorn.
Well, that's what I'm wondering, because I know that we spoke, I believe, in the lead up to the Taiwanese election. That was just in January. And at the time, China had been upping its military sort of intimidation tactics over Taiwan. So do you think that Lai would be fearing now, given that he said what he knows Beijing doesn't want to hear, that do you reckon he's bracing himself for even further or stronger military intimidation tactics?
It would be prudent. The scale and pace of physical intimidation of Taiwan across the Taiwan Strait has only increased over the last 20 years. It really stepped up to a new level 2 years ago, 2022, when Nancy Pelosi, the then Speaker of the US House of Representatives, visited Taiwan. From that moment, the Chinese mainland took that as the moment that they would ratchet up a level of intimidation, which they have not stepped back from. So that wasn't an episodic thing. That's now become a permanent thing. And I no longer have in my head the exact number of sorties, but there's no formal international border recognized between Taiwan and China because of the peculiar status of the claims. Both have to sovereignty, but over the other. But the median line, which divides the Taiwan Strait, roughly equidistant between the two, has been the de facto border for many years. And it was rare that the Chinese forces cross that. Well, now they cross it almost every day, mainly Air Force sorties, which forces the Taiwanese Air Force to scramble, to intercept them. And the pressure that that's put the Taiwanese forces under, it has become quite intense. This is not unique to Taiwan. The Chinese do this. The Chinese mainland also does this to Japan. They also do it in a naval harassment, intimidation, intrusion in South China Sea, with the Philippines, with Vietnam, Malaysia. It's pretty much a constant. But in Taiwan, they have nominated Taiwan as their the reddest of their red button issues, the country to whom they have openly claimed ownership, and the one that most acutely feels that pressure. And yes, I can't see that abating at all.
Peter, I want to turn now to what life is actually like on the ground for people in Taiwan, because you wrote about a fairly alarming how-to guide that has been issued to the people there by their own government. It's about how to survive an invasion by China. So I'd love to hear more about this, because I can only imagine how Australians might feel if we were issued that sort of thing by our government.
A guide on how to survive an invasion.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, it's a bit alarming, I suppose.
I mean, we'd be freaking out.
There's an interesting psychology that applies to a number of countries, lots of countries that live right next door to a big, threatening, autocratic state that from time to time says they're going to come and own you. So, for example, South Koreans are very relaxed about North Korea. It looks dangerous and threatening to the outside world, but people in South Korea, they've been living with it so long, I guess they're inured to it. So they just go about their daily lives. They don't think about it. They don't care. They occasionally have to have air raid drills and, invasion drills, but they just put it out of their minds the rest of the time. Likewise, Ukraine, right until the day when Russia invaded, Ukrainians, most of the Ukrainian people, including President Zelensky, were saying, oh, no, don't worry, but the Russians are just all full of bluster. They're not going to invade. Likewise, Taiwanese people, for a long time, until quite recently, have been very relaxed about it, going about their daily lives. So it's interesting, isn't it? I suppose the psychology is they have to live under this shadow permanently, so they just accept it and stop fretting about it. No point getting anxious every minute of every day, I suppose. It's changed a bit in Taiwan. The president who yesterday left office Tsai Ing-wen, she took a new and more strident approach. She was much more alarmed about Chinese invasion. She took pretty strict measures to deter China. She was quite realistic. She did not at any point say we can defeat the mainland. The mainland has 1.4 billion people. It has a military of 2 million. It has the world's biggest navy, bigger than the US, and it's only 180 kilometers away. Plus, it's nuclear armed. Taiwan, I mean, it's tiny, but Taiwan's got the same population as Australia, and it occupies a small island. So there's just no comparison. But what she did do is did a very unpopular thing. She reintroduced, they hadn't had it for a long time, compulsory military service for all males over 18 for 1 year. She dramatically stepped up investment in the military, in Taiwan's military. She launched Taiwan's first homemade submarine and bought a lot more gear from the US, which the US has been increasingly happy to supply Taiwan as the US's own level of alarm about China grows. So she's done all of that. The Taiwanese people's awareness of the threat has also stepped up as the Chinese have become more intimidating across the strait. And these survival guides, there have been 3 issued so far as I know. 2 years ago, the government issued one under Tsai Ing-wen, but it had cartoon pictures and was not seen as terribly serious.
Yeah.
For example, the very first, I think, first couple of pages had a list of QR codes you should use with your phone. In the event of an invasion, you can look for a bomb shelter, or when the water supply is cut off, you can find water. Well, to use a QR code, you need a phone with an internet connection, Wi-Fi or something. If the Chinese mainland is invading, do you think the internet's going to be functioning? No, it's going to be the first victim of any invasion. It's a prime target of any country to cut off their communication. So kind of silly stuff like that. And there was so much criticism. The government reissued the booklet, when was that? Last year. And it's bigger, it's more comprehensive. The cartoons are gone. It's got photos now.
It's serious.
Yeah, it's a bit more serious. And they give practical information about how to survive, how to tell enemy troops from Taiwanese troops because their uniforms are similar.
Yeah, right.
How to survive a nuclear blast, a nuclear attack. So it's got much more serious. And then a private sector guy saw this and all this, and he said, we need to do more. And so published his own survival guide. So now the market's awash in, I suppose I shouldn't laugh about it, it's terribly serious,
yes,
but guides on how to survive a Chinese mainland invasion. So it's become much more present in people's minds.
And so it's fascinating. It seems to reflect, I guess, a change in the perception of threat, perhaps, within Taiwan among the people there. So what is the mood on the ground there, if you know? Do most people want reunification with China or not?
There's a consistent poll series that's asked this question of the Taiwanese people since 1994, 30 years. And it shows a trend where support for unification with the mainland falls consistently over time. The last one in this series was published in February, and it was a record low, 1-point-something%. Only 1% of Taiwan's people want unification with China.
Wow.
Yeah, so that tells you the whole story, really.
And so you've written, I thought this was so interesting, that the harder Beijing pushes with various campaigns to get the more pro-Beijing party in Taiwan elected, the more the Taiwanese people are actually resisting. So how is that manifested?
Well, one manifestation is they keep voting for the party that is most unobliging, uncooperative with Beijing's wishes. That's a pretty big indicator. And although they've lost control of the parliament in this vote, voting for the presidency 3 terms, 3 4-year terms, that's a longer tenure than they've ever had. So that's one indicator. Another indicator is the number of Taiwanese people who identify as, whether you identify as Taiwanese only, mainland Chinese only, or both. A few years ago, 20 odd years ago, I suppose, it was about a quarter of Taiwanese people identified as either being all China mainland or China mainland and Taiwan identity. Now, in the latest poll, that's down to 2%. Only 2% of the Taiwanese people identify as being, somehow relating to mainland China. Mm. Everybody else sees themselves as Taiwanese only. So it's pretty, these are pretty interesting indicators. Again, it just goes to show what we've seen from Beijing, what we've seen from Xi Jinping ever since the pandemic, when China dropped the mask of win-win and friends to all, and started directly intimidating and threatening other countries, including ours, trade embargoes and all that stuff. The more Beijing pushes, the more the people in most countries push back. And Taiwan's a case study.
I mean, this is interesting to me. It seems to be a very tense time because China's getting more aggressive on the world stage. And then, as you just mentioned, fewer and fewer, a minuscule amount of Taiwanese people actually identify with mainland China. And I just wanted to find out how isolated or not Lai might be feeling in his bid to maintain a sovereign Taiwan, because we've spoken on this podcast before about how the United States is becoming an increasingly unreliable ally. So how might that be making him feel now, do you think?
Well, the big fear, of course, that everybody has around the world, anybody who relies on the US as an ally, is a Donald Trump presidency. But at the same time, the US has become a more reliable supplier to Taiwan. The scale, expense, and sophistication of the gear that the US is selling is unprecedented and continues. There was a vote in the House just a couple of weeks ago to supply more to Taiwan. And as I mentioned earlier, Joe Biden has now 4 times, when asked by reporters, would the US defend Taiwan if invaded by China, has given an unequivocal yes. His officials then always walk that back and say, well, what the president really meant was the existing policy, strategic ambiguity. He didn't really mean to say yes. But they keep asking him and he keeps saying yes. So
right. He
seems fairly clear in his own mind. So on the one hand, you do have a more supportive US. But yes, the Trump factor, as it is for, I suppose, just about everybody, is a big question mark.
And just to wrap up, I just wanted to find out how this might impact Australia, because as you noted, an Australian delegation of 5 federal MPs from both major parties were among the guests at Lai's inauguration on Monday. So what impact might that have on our relationship with Beijing, which has obviously been very tense and difficult, especially over the last couple of years?
Yeah. Well, Australia sent I suppose it's a routine level delegation. We didn't send a minister or a prime minister. We sent the same level of representation we've sent in the past. Of course, you can never satisfy Beijing's demands on anything to do with Taiwan because it has an absolutist position. So Beijing still complained about the Australian delegation and demanded that they respect China's sovereignty and all the rest of it. But on the other hand, it's also important that Australia not stop sending representation, because what we've learned from the last few years in Australia, but also elsewhere, if you appease China or Russia, it doesn't help your cause. China or Russia, whoever the autocrat is, will simply demand more. And Australia, as we know, the Chinese they did apply a political ban and a series of trade bans on Australia, and they were only lifted because Australia stood up to it. So it's important that Australia not start capitulating. The Albanese government has something called a stabilisation policy with China. They're happy for things to just stabilise, but it only operates one way, and the Chinese are happy to operate a destabilisation policy when it suits them. For example, we saw that intercept of an Australian Air Force Navy Seahawk helicopter, and before that we saw the HMAS Toowoomba, and the divers being zapped with the sonar. So China retains the right to destabilise. Australia just wants to stabilise, and that's what this delegation was all about.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for your time.
Pleasure, Samantha.